So I think there's this idea that floats around screenwriting circles that way back in the day, there was a group of writers or storytellers who gave us the pillars of unbreakable structure. And they wrote these ideas out that we had to write movies in 3 acts and these sorts of things. And after they made these rules, like we couldn't do anything else, and they just made them up and all this sort of stuff. But in reality, that's not actually what happened at all. The structure of stories was not created by people. It was discovered. Just like how Isaac Newton discovered gravity when the apple fell on his head, or whatever the anecdote is, we did the same thing. We realized that there was a structure innate with the stories that we were just telling. And so then we began to identify what that structure was. We realized that stories start out in a low conflict area, that we meet our characters and they begin to do something. They want something, or they are trying to figure out a problem, etc., etc. And then the problems escalate. It gets more interesting over time. We're more concerned with what will happen to them, what will they do, blah, blah. They encounter different problems, or maybe just one, or whatever. And then we sort of have this middle section. And then we realize that the stories end at the highest level of conflict and whether or not the character got what they wanted or solved the problem they were trying to solve. The concept is the same if it's a 6,000-page novel or a one-page scene that you've written. I've noticed this a lot in film schools and in writing classes and workshops and stuff, this sort of idea of anti-structure, and people think they're smart or intelligent or different because they're anti-structure. But the reality is, usually those people have, one, not really written anything, and two, don't really have any idea what they're talking about. Because structure is innate to stories. And sure, can you break structure? It's like, well, sure. Can you have a story with no conflict? You can, but that's sort of boring. But you can't. You might be able to have a story with no conflict, but you can't have a story with no beginning, middle, and end. Even if the story never rises or falls, or even if nothing interesting happens, there's a beginning. There's a point in the story where we meet our characters for the first time. There's a point in our story where we will leave our characters. And then there's things that happen in between those two moments. So there's always a beginning, middle, and end, even if there isn't that much conflict, or even if nothing much interesting happens. And so then there's this French idea. I think Jean-Luc Godard, the French director, said a story has a beginning, middle, and end, but not necessarily in that order. And that's another thing that people in film schools like to say, oh, how interesting, like, oh, what an interesting saying. And you really can't do that and have something that's that compelling. I mean, if you think about it, okay, if you take a story, you take the end, where the biggest problem is solved and this sort of stuff, and then you place that in the beginning, and then you put your beginning in the middle and your middle in the end, okay? So once you see your big problem, now we're going to see, oh, okay, how did this problem actually get to this point? Which has been done in stories and can work. But then once you get to the end of the middle, then you can say, okay, do we just end it, or do we come back to our highest point of conflict that we already showed in the beginning and then run through that again? So then what you've done is you haven't even placed your ending in the beginning. All you've done is teased the end that will also come in the end. So see, this just becomes a convoluted mess, right? It doesn't make any sense. And the reality is, when you have a story like this, it really just does have a beginning, middle, and end in the regular sort of traditional sense. Like it does still have a beginning, middle, and end. You are just trying to outsmart a system that is more or less inescapable. And so I think that if you're trying to be a writer, you should not focus on trying to break these rules, because you don't understand how stories work initially. Like, you don't know, if you haven't written anything, you don't understand how to make a good beginning and a good middle and a good end in the traditional sense. And now you're trying to do all these weird things and trying to add all these elements that you don't understand and trying to create this new structure. It's just stupid. It's just not what you should do. This is why so many new writers write just convoluted garbage, because they're trying to be just like the next great genius writer, and they don't even know how stories work yet. Know how stories work before you try to write things that are massively different or massively unique. You need to understand, if you write cliche stories, that's okay, at least for starting out, because then you can use what you learn by writing these stories that are more cliche, and you can understand how story structure works better to write something more unique in the long run. And the reality is, most great stories aren't great because they did something different with structure. Some might be, sometimes, very rarely. Most of the time, great stories just come from an understanding of structure, and the writer of the story really had something interesting to say, and they told it in an interesting, compelling way. And so that's what you should focus on. You should focus on being a good storyteller. You should focus on understanding how characters work and how they should work in your story. Understanding how conflict works. Understanding that stories do have beginning, middles, and ends in that order and in that way. And how you can actually harness that structure to help you and not to hinder you. Because those rules will actually benefit you in the long run. They won't harm you. Having rules and having structure helps you, because it helps you be more creative and try to tell something in a unique way. And so even when people talk about 4-act structure or 5-act structure, all they're saying is, when you have 4-act structure, usually what they're really just saying is you have beginning, middle, end, which is just 3-act structure. Or when you have 5-act structure, it's similar, where you have beginning, middle, end. Or sometimes you can have beginning, middle, and end. But if you really just look at this, it's all really just 3 acts. You know, all 5-act structure or 4-act structure is just going a little bit further into 3-act structure and defining segments a little more. I mean, that's what happens when you have like 22 story structure beats or whatever the screenwriting books tell you to do. It's just all 3-act structure. They're just trying to define as specifically as possible elements within that. But it's all 3-act structure, because all stories are beginning, middle, and end. And that's all I wanted to say today. I hope that's helpful, and I'll see you tomorrow.